World history is the world's court of justice. Let's dive right into this incredibly profound dilemma, shall we? It's 1945. The dust is just starting to settle on the most devastating conflict in human history. And philosopher Karl Jaspers begins a series of public lectures asking one central, absolutely haunting question: are the German people guilty? It's a question that forces us to really look at whether an entire nation can be held collectively responsible for the horrific atrocities committed by its leaders.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a deeply detailed academic dissertation by Malcolm Coates on post-World War II Germany. We'll be looking specifically at the monumental and frankly deeply flawed challenge of denazification in the American zone between 1945 and 1948. Our goal today is to understand exactly how the occupiers, the occupied, and a uniquely positioned religious institution tried to rebuild a society from total moral and physical ashes. It's a historical case study that forces us to ask some massive questions about modern justice, post-conflict nation building, and whether you can ever truly legislate morality.
To really grasp this, we have to transport ourselves back to May 1945. The document officially ending the war was signed on May 8th. Now, some historians call this Stunde Null, or 0 hour. But for the actual Germans living through it, they rarely felt liberated. Instead, they use the term Zusammenbruch, which translates to a disastrous collapse. Their government, their education system, their military, all completely destroyed. The German state as they knew it ceased to exist, completely replaced by 4 occupied zones.
26 million. Let that number sink in for a second. Because of relentless Allied bombings and Eastern expulsions, a staggering 26 million Germans were left completely homeless. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the entire population of modern-day Australia wandering through the rubble. So when we talk about denazification, we're not talking about a targeted legal process in a functioning society. We are talking about trying to implement a massive ideological purge on a population that is exhausted, starving, and largely without shelter. And that brings us directly to our primary source material for this explainer, Malcolm Coates' master's dissertation from the University of York. We're focusing our lens specifically on the American zone of occupation, which was headquartered in Frankfurt am Main under General Lucius Clay. Out of all the Allies, the United States made clearing out Nazi influence, denazification, the absolute highest priority of their military government. But before you can purge a society of its past, you actually have to define who is responsible.
Section 1. The question of guilt. Assigning guilt to a devastated population is an almost impossible philosophical puzzle. Karl Jaspers explored different degrees of this, and the contrast he makes here is vital. Criminal guilt is pretty straightforward, right? The criminal is always an individual who broke the law. But Jaspers argued for something much heavier, metaphysical guilt. He defined this as a solidarity among humans that makes us all co-responsible for every wrong committed in our presence or with our knowledge. So his crucial point was that even if an ordinary citizen didn't personally commit a crime, if they failed to do whatever they could to prevent it, well, Jaspers argued, they too are guilty. And there were certainly those who took an incredibly visceral, strict view on this idea of collective guilt. Take a look at this perspective from Austrian-born writer Hans Habe. He argued that, according to Western standards, the German people absolutely were collectively guilty. After all, they voted Hitler in. They sustained the regime, silently tolerated its abominable crimes, and, in his view, only objected to the war when they realized they were losing. From this perspective, the entire public actively enabled the Third Reich. But inside Germany, public opinion polls at the time showed that 70% of people firmly rejected this notion of total responsibility. Leaders like Theodor Heuss, who would actually go on to become West Germany's first president, offered a really powerful counterargument. Heuss warned that sweeping collective guilt dangerously mirrored the very logic the Nazis used against Jewish people, the idea that simply belonging to a group made you guilty. Instead, Heuss suggested that collective shame was the appropriate and frankly necessary burden for the German nation to bear moving forward. Section 2. The U.S. Denazification Policy. So, with these massive philosophical debates raging about who was actually responsible, how did the occupiers practically mandate a cleansing of this guilt? Well, the U.S. policy debate was incredibly intense. On one side, you had the terrifying Morgenthau Plan, proposed by the Secretary of the Treasury. This plan sought to completely deindustrialize Germany, basically turning it into a giant agricultural state, so it could never wage war again. Though President Truman ultimately abandoned it, calling it crazy, it absolutely terrified the German public. What actually went into effect was JCS 1067. This directive strictly ordered that Germany was not to be treated as a liberated people, but firmly as a defeated enemy nation. Guided by this really strict stance, the American zone took the harshest approach of all the Allies. Their paramount goal? It was kind of a logistical absurdity. They wanted to discover the background of every single German in their zone. I mean, just imagine trying to run a background check on millions of starving people with no functioning computers or mail systems. Everyone had to formally defend how they spent their time during the war years, and many were arrested without trial simply for having an affiliation with Nazism. It was a massive, sweeping dragnet. Section 3. The Protestant Church Responds. Now, with the Nazi state completely dismantled and civil society in ruins, who was actually left to represent the German people to this strict U.S. military government? To understand why this massive responsibility fell to a completely unexpected institution, we need to look at these numbers from 1933. Out of 65 million people, 41 million were Protestant and 21 million were Roman Catholic. Christianity, deeply rooted in the region since the Treaty of Westphalia, had a massive cultural footprint. Historically, the church and the German state were closely intertwined, and these sheer demographic numbers highlight just how dominant the influence of the Protestant church was in German society at the time. So the absolutely crucial point is this. When the entire secular government essentially evaporated in 1945, the churches became the only surviving organs of social continuity. They had largely maintained their pre-Nazi institutional structures. Practically overnight, they became proxy leaders for a totally leaderless population. And because churches existed globally outside of Germany, they were the only groups capable of building international relationships. On a purely practical level, if you were part of a desperate, shivering population, the church was where you went for food and warmth, rather than approaching the foreign military forces that had just bombed your city. Because of this unique leadership role, the church essentially had to face the guilt question head-on. Now, the Catholic Church maintained that guilt was purely individual, meaning the institution itself was innocent. But the Protestant Church, they made an incredibly bold move. In October 1945, they issued the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt. Acting as the sole voice of the people, the Protestant Church Council officially and publicly declared its own institutional guilt for the crimes of National Socialism. But despite this massive admission, they still saw the overarching American policy as a total disaster. Section 4. A Flawed Purge. History today largely agrees that this ambitious purge just collapsed under its own weight. Political scientist John Herz brilliantly summarized the whole fiasco in 1948. The system was just way too mechanical. The U.S. military government was trying to process millions of people through strict, rigid categories. As a result, major Nazi figures who were savvy enough often slipped right through the cracks because they didn't technically fit a specific category on paper. Meanwhile, large numbers of low-level civil servants, nominal Nazis, who maybe only joined the party just to keep their jobs, ended up losing absolutely everything. Because of all this, the policy unraveled incredibly quickly. The harshest phase under direct U.S. administration only lasted from May 1945 to March 1946. Overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the task, and with American troops eager to head home, the U.S. handed the process over to German administration, where, as you might guess, it immediately became much more lenient. By May 1948, the concept of collective guilt was no longer politically useful. The Cold War was beginning, the U.S. suddenly needed a strong German ally, and so they formally ended their involvement in denazification entirely. The church fought against the rigid U.S. denazification policy because they saw it failing their devastated congregations in real time. It was a mechanical solution to a profoundly deep moral catastrophe. Which leaves us with a lingering, truly provocative thought. When a society descends into such profound darkness, can a mechanical, bureaucratic process ever truly cleanse a nation of its past? Or does the metaphysical legacy of collective guilt simply endure forever, demanding we remain vigilant? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking those big questions.